If you drop your fruit willingly, stones can be minimized. Countdown. Crisis. Denouement. Viji's Mahasamadhi represented a strange irony, a tragedy for her husband and a triumph for her guru. And by a twist of fate, of course, both master and mate were the same man. Even for the guru, however, this wasn't an unalloyed triumph. For while Viji had left like an exemplary disciple, the timing of this event couldn't have been more inconvenient. The realization of her personal dream had become the obstacle to a larger one. The Dhyanalinga had been thwarted, not by a lack of zeal or commitment, but by too much of it, not by social immaturity, but by an excess of spiritual maturity. A fruit had ripened sooner than expected, and had no option but to fall. For Sadhguru, it meant putting aside the deep sense of personal loss and addressing the mission of lifetimes all over again. Once Viji attained Mahasamadhi, we were back to square one, he said. 95% of the work was done. Just a little more time. In one more week we would have completed the consecration. But now we got stuck. There was another factor that made this setback all the more aggravating. Time was running out. At 39, Sadhguru knew he didn't have much longer to live. He had already tried to prepare his daughter for this possibility, and remembers being astounded by her quiet acceptance and exceptional level of understanding. Her mother has just passed away. I brought her back home and kept her with me for some days. When I was taking her back to school, after 3 or 4 days, I saw she was just fine. I thought maybe she didn't understand what had happened. Maybe she hadn't even grasped it. I asked her, "Is it okay that Viji is gone?" She said, "I know she's gone. She told me she would go." I said, "Do you know that you will never see her again?" She said, "Jaggi, do dead people come back? I know she won't come back." Then I said, "Is it okay with you?" She had talked to me about it. "It's okay with me." Then I said, "Is it okay if I leave?" She said, "Wait till I grow up and then leave." That's when I thought, okay, I have somebody really beautiful on my hands. In the next year and a half, Bharati saw her master go through an excruciating time. "I won't forget the struggles he went through," she says. "The urgent need was to find a replacement for Viji." Sadhguru experimented with several meditators, but to no avail. He tried many people, recalls Bharati, but it wasn't the same. I knew it too. I could feel it. That was when Sadhguru had to take a tough decision. There was clearly no time to put a third person through the preparations that Viji had been through. He had no option but to play the role himself. Time was short, he says. There were many people around me in high states of energy, but that energy wasn't supported by adequate mental maturity. For the consecration, we needed fluid energies. This loosens the fixed boundaries of who you are. If you make a person's energies fluid, he's a nuclear bomb. But the moment you do this, people start doing immature things. They start getting protective of their privacy. They want to preserve aspects of their personality. You need a certain distance between yourself and your thought processes if this is to work. I had many good people around me, energy-wise, but their minds still weren't sufficiently mature. This is still the case. Playing Viji's role meant the recreating of her energy body with his own. This reconstruction was so detailed and complete that many felt Viji's presence tangibly around the ashram in the months that followed. Many times it appeared to me as if Viji was there, back with us, confirms Bharati. We could smell the familiar smell of her body and her energies. But this required a tremendous amount of energy, and was not done unless absolutely necessary. Sitting at Sadhguru's feet, nothing seemed impossible any more. But the process took its toll. After 5 hours of the consecration process, Sadhguru would emerge drained and exhausted. Managing 2 bodies with a single person's energy severely depleted his resources. In 11 months' time, I aged about 25 to 30 years, he says. I became old and sick. All kinds of bizarre diseases were there in my body. When they took my blood test in the United States, they couldn't believe it. The results were as if I had some devastating diseases in my body. As her master pulled out the stops to complete the process, Bharati was put through a strenuous personal regimen. I did lots of sadhana. We didn't want the energy we'd built up to dissipate. At the same time, I could see his health failing. I could see the decline. He'd be weak and fragile. His kidneys were failing. His liver was damaged. There were lumps on his body. His blood was a mess. The photographs of Sadhguru at the time reveal a man who seemed suddenly to have aged drastically. In those 18 months, I lost almost 20 to 25 years of my life. You wouldn't believe it. This moment I would be perfectly okay, but if you saw me after 1 hour, I'd be absolutely medically sick. Not just tired, medically ill. You could take my blood samples and see everything is wrong. They'd tell me I had cancer. After 15 days they'd check, and everything would be okay with me. If I sat here for one process, huge lumps would appear in my body. After another 3 hours, you'd see they had gone. It was unbelievable. I don't expect you to believe it. What sustained him through the physical storms and ravages was the knowledge that he would shed his body as soon as the consecration was complete. For his disciples, this was a tense and difficult time. They knew that something momentous was being attempted, but they also knew their time with their master was short-lived. They watched, silent and ineffectual, as his physical condition deteriorated rapidly before their eyes. The deterioration showed in his day-to-day work. His reflexes and body as a whole, says Bharati. Many times I stood by helplessly, not knowing what to do when I found him in physically broken condition after certain sessions. At times, in very difficult situations, It appeared to me that Sadhguru might just have to leave to make the Dhyanalinga happen. But these thoughts never stayed very long. Something within me told me we'd have both Sadhguru and the Dhyanalinga with us. But something darker and more disquieting was to consume the attention of the residents of the ashram and the citizens of Coimbatore for the next 18 months. Something that shook the fledgling Isha movement to its very foundation. For Viji's departure was followed by another crisis, but this time of a magnitude that none had expected. It was the long-awaited social backlash, but far more savage and vindictive than they had ever imagined. Venkana Babu had warned of this eventuality months ago. Sadhguru had envisaged it too. I instinctively knew it was coming, but I didn't know how and from where it would come. And yet, at the time of Viji's Mahasamadhi, he had already put his finger on the likely source of the problem. Here we live in a different atmosphere, he had told his meditators. For us, this situation is very natural. But in the society outside, many doubts and suspicions will be cast upon the whole event. He was right. It started when the uncle of a meditator swooped down on the ashram with a bunch of hired goons and took the young man home by force. The story was a familiar one. The meditator wanted to live in the ashram. His family was opposed to it. This was in itself not an entirely new occurrence. Families of new meditators and initiates were often hostile. There was one strand of Coimbatore society that remained suspicious of Sadhguru's rapidly mushrooming flock of disciples. Sadhguru had urged the family to discuss things with the meditator, a 32-year-old and not an impressionable minor by any means, and take him home with his consent. But when neither pleas nor threats seemed to work, the family had decided to resort to force. The meditator revealed later that he was kept drugged for several months and had no clue of what was happening around him. When the meditator's resolve to relocate to the ashram showed no sign of wavering, the family decided to go on the offensive. The uncle proceeded to instigate a smear campaign by provoking a family that was at the time at its most vulnerable. Viji's parents, still shell-shocked and bewildered by their daughter's sudden death, were swayed by the man's outrage. Events followed in rapid succession. A police complaint was filed against Sadhguru for the murder of his wife. Ironically, it was 8 months after her death. Allegations of dowry harassment were flung around freely. The campaign was swift and precisely aimed. The media joined the fray, a Tamil magazine spearheading the movement. Sadhguru was abroad at the time of the fracas, but he was surely in no doubt that the darkest hour in Isha's history had arrived. The carefully cultivated goodwill of the past decade seemed to have been gutted in a matter of weeks. He says the slander mattered little to him personally, and yet the accusation of a dowry-related murder could not have left undisturbed a fiercely independent man who had just lost his wife. But the focus of his attention had to be one-pointed. and he knew that for the Dhyanalinga there could not have been a more ill-timed setback. We were expecting trouble, but it came in every way, from every direction. We spent a year or 18 months in daily crisis management. When I say crisis, I mean that these people had created a situation that was threatening our very existence. The time to act had arrived. Sadhguru says he returned to the ashram and set about doing what he is usually reluctant to do. I settled them, he says cryptically. Coming from a yogi whose sphere of operations includes the invisible and esoteric, one is not quite sure what that means. But it does suggest that he intervened in the plot in the way he wouldn't ever have allowed himself under normal circumstances. In a short span of time, the vested interests that had been instrumental in whipping up rage and revenge found themselves dealing with unexpected havoc in their own lives. The complaint was withdrawn, and the campaign died a natural death. And today, less than 10 years later, says Sadhguru with a gleam of quiet amusement in his eyes, we are a phenomenon in Tamil Nadu. Our work is concentrated in this state, and the vested interests have fallen silent. While his knowledge of the human psyche is profound, Sadhguru still marvels at certain acts of compulsion of which the human species is capable. Jealousy, he says, is an emotion he has never understood. It is an emotion that he has attracted a great deal over several lifetimes. His air of self-possession and his refusal to care for the opinions of others have no doubt been responsible for people's fear and resentment. But despite having confronted the emotion at close quarters, he says it makes little sense to him. It's unfamiliar to me. I've never understood how people can allow jealousy to become so big in their lives that they're willing to actually destroy someone because of it. At the same time, there is nothing tame about the Isha spiritual process, and he knows that it can be deeply threatening to those who prefer a cozier weekend spirituality. I am not into the solace peddling business, which will always find appreciation in the world, he admits. When you talk about a fundamental transformation in life, you will find enormous resistance in the world. If you want to do hardcore spirituality, it is very difficult because it demands a drastic transformation in the human being. This spirituality is not for people who just want to feel good. It is for people who are truly seeking to move from one dimension of life to another. So usually, this never grows popular. Why many great masters never started large movements is because when you start a large movement, you have to compromise. When Shiva was around, or when Agastya was around, this kind of spiritual transformation happened in a big way. But in the last few thousand years, such a hardcore spiritual process hasn't really gathered momentum. Somehow, with dedication, cunning, and an enormous amount of grace, we have achieved even this much, but it is very rare. For the Isha volunteers, this was a particularly testing time. Many of them had flouted parental wishes and renounced familial obligations to commit themselves full-time to the movement. But now their life choices were being held up to scathing public scrutiny. allegations of cultism, dissolute lifestyles, and chemically induced trips fostered by the hallucinogenic magic gruel hung thickly in the air. That's when we decided to turn aggressive, remembers Raja. We had focused so far on sadhana and individual growth. Now we decided to make a concerted effort to reach out and share what we had. We wanted to touch people, to let them know what we were, what we had to offer, what we were capable of. The alternative was to be wiped out. For Raja and his Isha teachers, the regimen that unfolded was more grueling than it had ever been. 3 classes of 3 hours each were held each day by a single teacher. A class was held within every 60 kilometers, covering the entire state of Tamil Nadu. Each program was for 13 days. There were nights we only got 2 to 3 hours of sleep. And sometimes, when there were 4 programs in immediate succession, I wouldn't come home for 2 months at a time. Facing the suspicion of the participants wasn't easy. There would always be 2 in a class of 50 who had questions, recalls Raja. They were all the predictable questions about the credentials of the Guru and about the rumors of drugs and sex. It was tricky. 2 disruptive participants could mean that you could lose the rest of the 48, he says. But the teachers remained determinedly calm, answering the questions with an unstudied sincerity. The commitment of the teachers commanded respect. They lived with the families of local meditators, and their integrity was increasingly apparent to all those who interacted closely with them. Word gradually spread that the Isha volunteers, whether you agreed with them or not, actually walked the talk. It took us 3 to 4 years, says Raja, but the tide of opinion did change. He recounts how, in a dramatic volte-face, one of the Tamil journalists involved in the Isha sting operation actually did the program many years later. It was in 2001 in Chennai. I was told that he was among the participants. I was conscious of his presence, but I paid no particular attention to him. At the end of the 13-day program, when I was about to board the train from Chennai, he came up to me, apologized profusely, and wept. There were tears in my eyes, too. Today, years later, we're actually good friends. It was at this time that Sadhguru and 200 meditators undertook a trip to the Someshwar temple in Kudappa. The group was aware that the temple had special associations for their guru. Sri Palaniswami had been there. Sadhguru Sri Brahma had spent the last months of his life there. This visit obviously had a deep significance. It was also intended, many of them guessed, to help dissolve some of the blocks that had plagued them on their journey. Sadhguru took a golden snake as an offering for the linga at the temple, says Ma Karpuri. There was a particularly warm and generous local reception in Kudappa, she recalls, and Sadhguru was treated with much reverence. But now another challenge presented itself. As Sadhguru approached the sanctum, the temple priests turned suddenly hostile. A slew of objections poured forth. They said I wasn't a Brahmin. They started talking about caste, Gotram, Kulam, all kinds of things, and said the linga would be finished if I entered, says Sadhguru. The temple trustee tried to reason with them. He said, "Look, this man's brought an offering. He has a past association with this temple. Let him in." He even said my Gotram was Shiva. But the Brahmins were adamant. So there was this huge argument going on. I was just watching this, a smile on my lips. On the one hand, here was this temple and all that it meant to me. And on the other hand, there were these guys who work for a salary telling me I didn't have the right to be there. I was just standing there, watching this whole farce, but I wasn't relenting either. And that's when Bharati suddenly got mad. She just tore into those guys like a bull terrier. Ma Karpuri remembers the scene with clarity. I've never seen Bharati like that before. She told the priest that if they didn't allow it, they would have to face the consequences. She was actually saying, "You'd better let him in now or else." Whether it was in sheer shock or terror, no one knew, but the priests took to their heels. The temple was available to Sadhguru and the meditators for 3 energy-saturated days. We did our own puja to Shiva, says Sadhguru, and the situation was just explosive. Those were different days. I won't set fire to a situation like that ever again. Eventually, the outraged priests were mollified and coaxed back into the temple by assurances from the trustee and the collector that they would be compensated for the many elaborate purification rituals they had to undergo to restore the defiled linga. While the group remembers that Bharati's outburst had turned the tide of the events that day, Sadhguru recalls the moment for other reasons as well. It was one big joke, he says, because that's exactly what happened a lifetime ago when Sadhguru Sri Brahma and Vibhuti walked into that temple. The Brahmins had objected then as well. But when these 2 men, who were just burning with intensity at that time, turned and looked at them, they simply scooted. And here was Bharati doing the same thing all over again. I had a big laugh. It was the same situation replaying itself. Whether it was the visit to the Someshwar temple that did it, no one was quite sure. But Ma Karpuri recalls that the obstacles on the path to the Dhyanalinga seemed considerably reduced. On a personal level, our spiritual journeys seemed easier as well. Things began to return to normal. Looking back on the first fraught decade of the Isha movement, Sadhguru says, "In the first 10 years of our existence, people threw stones at us. But people only throw stones because they unconsciously know your fruit is valuable. Bearing fruit," he adds, "is more significant than being stoned. Because fruit attracts birds, animals, and people, not just stones. Also, those who throw stones don't cut you down. They only do what they know best. Throw stones." After a pause he remarks, "And if you drop your fruit willingly, stones can be minimized." Perhaps that made the difference. A dream that aimed to make the fruit of self-transformation available to all could be deferred, but not destroyed. Having waited centuries to reach its fruition, It could now no longer be denied. The stones were part of the journey, but they meant little to a tree that sought to share its fruit, not withhold it. None was to be discriminated against. Everyone was called, everyone chosen. The Dhyanalinga's hour seemed to have come. Those who witnessed the process knew they would never be the same again. It was exhilarating, says a brahmacharini, her eyes still radiant at the memory. The energy levels were unimaginable. We didn't know what was going on, but we knew we were participating in something enormous. Perhaps the enormity of the accomplishment is only evident when one hears Sadhguru speak of earlier attempts that had ended in disaster and futility. In addition to his own concerted efforts for 3 lifetimes, an even more dramatic and poignant story is that of the Dhyanalinga that almost was over 1,000 years ago. It happened in Bhojpur, near the city of Bhopal in Madhya Pradesh. 14 people, 7 men and 7 women, were prepared for several years for the ambitious project. However, in the final stages of the consecration, just the evening before its completion, in an incident eerily reminiscent of Viji's Mahasamadhi centuries later, one of the women left her body. The temptation to leave the body is so much, says Sadhguru, because here you have an opportunity where your contact with the body is so minimal that with little effort you can leave it. It's absolute dissolution. There was also probably the euphoria of seeing the end in sight. Her efforts slackened, her focus wavered at the last moment, and the goal was missed. The yogi in charge of the process was disheartened, but did not give up. He decided to play the roles of the man and the woman, using his Ida and Pingala, which is an enormous stress on the system. He played this role and would have completed the process because what was left was very little, says Sadhguru. Here again the scenario was uncannily similar to the Isha counterpart. The end seemed almost in sight when a local invasion occurred. In the ensuing combat, the yogi's left foot was severed. Now his Ida was rendered useless, and the entire process came to a grinding halt once again. The situation was desperate. Another woman was trained rapidly for the task. It was now decided that there was no alternative but for the yogi and the woman to shed their bodies and merge with the linga, thereby completing the consecration. Another disciple was put in charge of locking the chakras once they were energized. This was a vital function. Without the locking of the chakras, the energies would dissipate. The scene was set. The participants were fully prepared. And then came the fall. The disciple in charge of locking the chakras was overwhelmed by the situation. To remain unperturbed and vigilant while his beloved guru left his body wasn't easy. The situation was too overwhelming, says Sadhguru. Your guru, your master, your life and breath dropped his body. You were sitting there watching. It was too much. He couldn't do it. And so the disciple hesitated. The chakras weren't locked in time, and the linga remained tragically misshapen. Immediately, says Sadhguru, the linga cracked vertically through. The whole project was abandoned. It was 95% done, but it is a painful form. 2 people gave their lives. They had done so much work on it, but it had not been fulfilled. The linga remains just like that, very powerful, but slightly distorted. The energy is not receding. If it had been consecrated with mantras, it would have receded by now. 1,000 years is a lot of time, but it hasn't receded. The linga stayed there, incomplete, broken. When Sadhguru visited Bhojpur with Bharati at the time of the Dhyanalinga consecration, he said he felt an excruciating pain in his spine when he was about 8 kilometers away from the shrine. When they reached the temple, there was a sudden numbness in his left foot, making it difficult for him to get out of the car. For Bharati, the linga became such a powerful experience that she almost left her body. She thought she had been sitting in meditation for a few minutes, but 3/4 of an hour passed, and Sadhguru had to work intensively on her Agnya chakra to bring her back. Both had experienced the tragic history of the crippled, incomplete linga in their own ways. To rectify the Bhojpur linga, said Sadhguru, would have been more demanding than creating a new one. Besides, the shrine was in the hands of the Archaeological Society, and objections to any kind of intervention were likely to be considerable. Sadhguru and Bharati left the place, uneasily aware that the story of the distorted Bhojpur linga could repeat itself yet again. It almost had. Sadhguru's description of the Dhyanalinga consecration has to be the most lucid account in recorded history of an incredibly arcane yogic process. The aim, he says, was to create an energy form with 7 chakras operating at their optimal condition. In the human being, the chakras are held in place by karmic substance. For the Dhyanalinga, however, he was clear that no karmic substance was to be used. And yet without it, the chakras could not be locked, which would mean the entire form would dissipate. The challenge, therefore, was to lock the chakras with pranic substance from all 3 participants, although this lacked the tenacity of its karmic counterpart. If the other 2 involved in the consecration were with me, I would have locked it with so much more ease, he said later. Since one person was missing, creating 3 threads of prana without karmic substance from 3 different bodies, taking and weaving it and tying it up in a certain way was difficult. The 3 threads were actual nadis or channels, one from Bharati, one of mine, and another also from me, created in Viji's flavor. Taking nadis out of one's system could be damaging. It has to be done with care, and elaborate precautions were taken to limit the damage. Since his own role was multifunctional, it was not easy to avoid damage altogether. The result was that his body was besieged by a host of major and minor physiological difficulties. I didn't want to play the music, he says lightly. Initially I thought there would be 14 people, and I would do the conducting. But here I ended up playing the music anyway. And after Viji left, I had to play double music. two instruments at the same time. Other than the actual act of binding the energies, which entailed some amount of karma, there was no individual karma invested in the Dhyanalinga. Each chakra was established and locked, moving systematically from top to bottom. Although the process of locking the higher chakras was more subtle, the more physically demanding were the lower chakras. The main challenge, says Sadhguru, was the lower chakras, the Swadhisthana and the Muladhara. Since one person was missing, the process took an enormous toll on my body, weakening my Swadhisthana and Muladhara. It was like I could leave at any moment. Raja accompanied him to Chennai, where he chose a specific kind of stone for the linga. Much of the actual consecration work, however, was done with a copper rod that Sadhguru kept in his home. We bystanders didn't know what was happening, says Raja. We would be sitting around watching him as he sat and supervised the establishment of the stone linga. But when the process started, which was usually late in the night, we would know right away. The energies would be so high. He describes his own role as that of a soldier at the time, a trusted lieutenant, not quite sure of what was going on, but ready to guard his guru's mission with his life against a hostile world. Even Bharati, who was actively involved in the process, had no clue to the technicalities involved. All she could see was that she was in charge of a bravura conductor. I remember the Lingara drum, the copper tube containing mercury, energized with qualities of the 7 chakras, which was to be inserted into the lingam and sealed before the completion of the consecration. This was a major step. Each chakra was energized with intense sadhana, lasting many days at a time. We were oblivious of day and night as these indescribable energy situations occurred. The energies leaped and danced in my chakras and nadis, tearing my body apart. After energizing each chakra, Sadhguru would share the process with the brahmacharis and inmates in the ashram. These satsangs were pure ecstasy. Many days of sadhana were shared with them in a short time. For those who witnessed the process, perhaps the most intriguing was the locking of the throat chakra or Vishuddhi, known as the seat of power. Vishuddhi meditation, Sadhguru explained, is rarely encouraged, since it can create needlessly powerful people who lack the responsibility and balance to handle that power. Since time was short and the Vishuddhi needed to be energized, Sadhguru eventually decided to use a one-time yogi for the process. He was a disembodied being looking for dissolution, he said later. It was late night on an Amavasya, and over 500 or 600 people were witness to this process. We used a coconut in a certain way to trap this being and do what we had to do. He was being willingly trapped, not unwillingly. Once he realized how he was going to be used, he was more than willing. So we actually trapped this yogi, made him into pure energy, and put him in the Vishuddhi chakra. He became part of the Dhyanalinga. A brahmachari recalls that once the coconut was set in a certain place, a little snake crawled up to it right away. Sadhguru explained later that snakes are invariably attracted to a certain kind of energy. It wasn't surprising. The energy that night, recalls the brahmachari, was tremendously powerful. When questioned about the dubious ethics of trapping a disembodied being, Sadhguru's reply was crisp. As long as something is serving the purpose of liberating people, everything is okay with me. Just about anything is okay with me. I'm not somebody who is coming from some value structure or ethics or morals. What I'm saying may sound dangerous to you, but anybody who is on the path, this is how they are. He did add, however, that the whole process of sadhana for any spiritual aspirant is about moving away from a limited set of identifications, physical, mental, and cultural. In this process of individual dissolution, the aim is to terminate entirely the notion of a separate. There was a he when we caught him, but when we put him there, when the Vishuddhi was consecrated, there was no he anymore. It's like somebody was making a pot, a mud pot. The pot was done, but not burnt yet. I took it and again made it into mud, and then again made a linga out of it. That's how it is. You're thinking in terms of, oh, that person, is he trapped there? What will happen to him? What about his evolution? There is no him anymore. I just made him into the dhyana linga. It's just that we used this energy, which was going around like a fool, as an individual. I destroyed his individuality and merged him into the dhyana linga. So there is no him really, but that's how far language can go. And what happened to the karma of the disembodied being? How did he dispel with that? Did he take it upon himself? Sadhguru's reply was brief. Where else to take it? The most distinctive feature of the entire consecration process was the fact that it entailed no rituals or mantras. This, Sadhguru has often pointed out, is a characteristic of the South Indian tradition of yoga, associated with the sage Agastya. Everything here is done with pure energy. We don't care to use mantras. We simply use energy. Simply direct force, as it is. This is a completely different path and attitude. It's a different dimension altogether. Perhaps what awed those who witnessed the entire Dhyanalinga process most of all was Sadhguru's unwavering clarity. Despite the constantly changing variables, he never seemed flustered or agitated, and he showed no doubt or hesitation during what was clearly a highly sophisticated and elaborate process. It was a knowledge evidently born of the simple act of his guru's touching his forehead with his staff 2 lifetimes ago. Whenever the need to know any dimension of life presented itself, at that moment the answers were always there within me, he says. Life has always been like that for me. As he said recently at a satsang, the only thing I'm really good at is making the air around me crackle with energy. I'm not a great teacher, you know. I do that only because, without blabbering all the time, it doesn't work in the world. Those around at the time confirm that what they witnessed was indeed someone with a masterly understanding of atmospherics. The crackle was very much in evidence. Another dramatic moment was when Sadhguru created a hairline crack in the stone structure of the linga with a simple clap of his hands. Those who watched were stupefied. They were well aware that the linga was made of the highest density granite in Asia, over 4,200 plus units. But by this stage, such casual miracles seemed almost common around their guru. He explained it to them later. During the process of consecration, just in case I shed the body, we knew locking the energies would be a huge problem. We didn't want such a problem to happen. I have always kept it as a possibility that in case the consecration didn't happen as planned, the only way for me would be to merge into it, and somebody else would have to lock the energies. It would have been very much possible that the linga, unable to contain the energies, would have opened up. As a safeguard against this, I effected a minute vertical crack in the linga. There are those who remember how he fell after the mammoth challenge of locking the Swadhisthana. It seemed like the end had actually arrived. As each chakra was locked, I felt it distinctly in my energy body, says Bharati. When it came to the Swadhisthana, the most difficult part of the process, as his physical body was very unstable, Sadhguru was in utmost physical pain. Sadhguru was not unaware of the risks involved. There was every possibility that I could lose my body at that moment. I kept everything ready, to a point where I had arranged legal adoption for my daughter, the ashram, how it should be maintained, everything was written down. I had the samadhi ready, and I just asked them to park a vehicle outside. If I totally lost the body, that was fine. They knew how to handle it. But suppose I became incapacitated and I needed to be brought in, then the vehicle, an old Tata Sierra, would be there. Raja recalls that the brahmacharis were asked to sit facing the linga, while the householder disciples were instructed to sit facing away from it. After a few meditation processes, Sadhguru climbed onto the base of the linga. He told the assembly to close their eyes. They complied with bated breath. A little while later, they heard a thud. When they opened their eyes, they found he had fallen. The consecration was complete, but Sadhguru, it seemed, had paid the price. The residents watched as a team of brahmacharis carried his inert body out to the car. He seemed alive, but only just. They knew it was touch and go. For 3 days he couldn't stand. He had lost his speech and communicated only through notes. My body was broken beyond repair, he says. Medically, I was definitely beyond repair. To start again was almost like trying to create a new life. Bharati did her best to restore his broken system, but there seemed little hope. He remained silent, frail, unresponsive. At one point, at her wit's end, she asked him, "Shall we hit the road?" It was a shot in the dark. If there was anything that could rekindle his zest for life, it was probably his wanderlust. That's when a gleam returned to his eyes, she recalls with a smile. Why did a man who had been prepared for the last 17 years to leave at the age of 42 consider staying back? Not because I was desperate to live, he quips. The more deadly serious a situation is, the more of a joke it is for me. When Bharati asked me this question, I thought, okay, let's see, just for fun, if I can put my body together again. Later it became a challenge. Despite his playful take on it, the decision to put the body mechanism together was no doubt motivated by the fact that he now had a group of disciples for whom Sadhguru meant their very life breath. He was also probably aware that his continued presence would make the social acceptance of the Dhyanalinga that much easier. There was the social consideration, he acknowledges, but above all, there were too many people around me who were at the point where I needed to push them and see them through. These people have stood by me in more ways than others understand. They stood like solid rocks. There have been many who have been willing to stand by me emotionally. I'm not belittling that, but you don't interfere with death for emotion. These people were different. They were willing to live or die for me. They became so involved on an energy level that they didn't know the difference between me and them. They have mingled and merged with my very life process. My staying behind was for them, to see them through to the end. While his health is considerably better now, he says he is still on life support. I used my energy so excessively in the consecration process, it caused serious damage to my system. My energy system was badly mutilated. Since then, I have had to be dependent on certain people for my survival. I'm still not 100% recovered. Right now, I can seem to be in perfect health, and in the next moment, I can be seriously ill, medically ill. But I have largely come out of that phase. He is often asked about the prominent snake-shaped copper ring he wears around his right ankle. It's a shackle, he has explained. It keeps me anchored to the body. Restructuring this body has been a huge challenge. Many people literally give me their lives so I could use their energies to slowly restructure this body. I'm almost 80% all right now, but I could fix the rest if I had just a 1 month break. But I haven't had the time. Since my health keeps fluctuating, people around me have been very afraid that I will leave. So they've put this shackle on me. It stabilizes the system. It doesn't allow me to accidentally slip off. But what does it feel like to live your life on constant life support? I once asked him. It means tremendous freedom, he chuckled. But it also means enslavement, he added. The day I remove it, you know I have very little time left. Within 40 days, I'll be gone. The Dhyanalinga consecration was completed on 23rd June 1999. The shrine was opened to the public in November that year. The last year of the millennium marked the end of what must surely have been the darkest chapter in Sadhguru's life and in the youthful history of Isha. While the mood at Isha was exultant, the world was as yet unaware, and much of it continues to be, of the historic significance of the achievement. Sadhguru has often said it will take a couple of generations for the world to fully appreciate just what the Dhyanalinga signifies for humanity at large. And what exactly is the Dhyanalinga anyway? It remains an enigma, even to those whose lives have been profoundly touched and changed by it. What every viewer sees is the imposing black stone ellipsoid. But Sadhguru has often said that the form can be disposed with altogether. The only reason for its existence is that most people need a visual focus for their meditation. The actual linga is essentially a fully functional subtle body, entirely invisible, with all the 7 chakras operating optimally. Its function is essentially meditative. While the well-known Jyotirlingas in various parts of the country address specific issues of health and material well-being, the Dhyanalinga is the only linga that addresses all the 7 chakras simultaneously. Sitting in its precincts is equivalent to sitting in the presence of a live master, one who showers his grace unceasingly, freely, impartially, and silently. It is the highest manifestation of the divine, says Sadhguru. It is like a living person with all the 7 chakras manifesting themselves at their peak. It is alive. There have been certain recurrent questions about the linga that Sadhguru answers patiently each time, as if he were negotiating them for the first time. Why the Shiva Linga form is a frequently asked question. He replies that sitting in the intensely charged space of the Dhyanalinga requires no specific belief system. You don't need any belief. You just need to be open, that's all. Let's say a non-believer drives a car. Will it go? This is what you're asking. Or if a non-believer sits here, will this light still make him see? The question is of that nature. It doesn't matter if you're a believer or a non-believer. The moment you turn on the light, it is there for everybody. Believers don't get any extra light. He explains that the first primordial energy form is in the shape of an ellipsoid, and the final energy form before dissolution assumes the same shape. Hence the linga. Indian culture came up with the figure of Shiva to represent this deep understanding of the existential dimension. Shiva, as Sadhguru reiterates, means that which is not, an unsettling concept, and an even more threatening reality if one allows it into one's life. We use Shiva because it's very difficult to get attached to him. In Tamil Nadu, you have been told that you shouldn't keep Shiva's form in your house. If he's there, his very form is such that all your attachments will get destroyed, and you don't want that. You've made very big investments in your attachments, and even though they have brought you very painful dividends, you still can't throw them away. These investments may melt away without you knowing what's happening. That's why they told you to banish Shiva from your house. The Dhyanalinga, then, is a project that virtually ensnares the most radical, the most terrifying and luminous divinity in the Indian spiritual pantheon. It is a project that turns that which is not into that which is, to the extent that such a paradox is possible. The Dhyanalinga, says Sadhguru, is almost like trapping Shiva and keeping him there. He doesn't come down very easily. He demands his own price in his own way. It is a very deep science. Is the linga a phallic symbol? This is another routine query. Sadhguru explains that the linga is a combination of the feminine and the masculine, one of the most unique and audacious ideas conceived by Eastern spiritual culture. When the masculine and the feminine meet at the lowest level, it is known as sex. When the same masculine and feminine meet at the highest level, it signifies the union of Shiva and Shakti. In this conjunction, Shiva is Rupa, or form. Shakti is Shunya, or nothingness. Shiva is Purusha. Shakti is Prakriti, the undifferentiated force of nature. The linga yoni, as the manifestation of the Shiva-Shakti principle, demonstrates the persistence of all pairs of opposites. Nothing can exist in this universe without its opposite or contrast. At the recent consecration of the Linga Bhairavi, he explained this further. The Dhyanalinga temple is like a womb. It's the yoni of the Devi. When we say yoni, we mean the womb, which was seen as a sacred space that all of us have to inhabit in the most crucial part of our making. Always, wherever Shakti and Shiva, the linga and yoni are presented, it is the inside of the womb that you're seeing, not the outside. So when you enter the Dhyanalinga space, you are actually inside the womb. And why are there no rituals in the Dhyanalinga? Is it to cater to the sensitivities of those who visit it as a multi-religious shrine? Sadhguru explains that rituals are traditionally a means to renew the energy of a sacred space. But the Dhyanalinga has been consecrated through pure energy work and requires no maintenance or revival. Performing any ritual would be absolutely meaningless, because Dhyanalinga has gone through prana pratishta. It is in the highest level of intensity that any form can be. If you intensify the energy beyond this, it's bound to become formless. It is a complete system of energy. In a space like this, rituals would be of no significance and out of place. The South Indian tradition of yoga, associated with the sage Agastya, is evidently known to specialize in this kind of prana mastery. Among the Saptarishis, the 7 sages, all direct disciples of Shiva who started the process of yoga, Agastya is the ultimate in Kriya Yoga, Sadhguru has said. If you say Kriya, it means Agastya. That's how it is. Anything and everything that can be done on the level of human energy has been talked about and done by this man in a miraculous way. So everybody who comes from the tradition of Kriya naturally claims their lineage to Agastya. Not to claim a pedigree, but just to express gratitude to a man who was so much larger than life. He is supposed to have lived for 4,000 years. We don't know about that, but he definitely must have lived for an extraordinary length of time to have made the spiritual process a reality for every human habitation on the Deccan Plateau. He brought yoga into people's lives without a label, without a format, just as a simple everyday life process. The southern part of India is still enjoying the benefits of his work. Sadhguru terms the shrine with quiet authorial pride as an engineering marvel. The elliptical dome that we built to house the Dhyanalinga is 76 feet in diameter and 36 feet high. No steel, no cement, and no concrete have been used. Just brick and mud mortar stabilized with lime, sand, alum, and herbal additives. It's the only structure like this on the planet right now. The simple technology used in this is that all the bricks are trying to fall down at the same time, but the way the dome is made, they can never fall. The nature of the design ensures a life of at least 5,000 years for the dome, and it is built upon a sand foundation which ensures that it's unaffected by seismological movement. What is not immediately apparent to the visitor is the extent to which the average anonymous Isha volunteer has contributed to the actual making of the temple. Even the building of the temple was undertaken by volunteers, says Ma Karpuri. There were 250 laborers and 1,000 of us, and we worked on that structure brick by brick. They knew that each of those bricks had been hard-earned, for they had been equally involved in the preceding months of spirited fundraising. Sadhguru's cause had become their cause, and all his disciples were determined to do their bit, right down to the little schoolgirl who decided to hoard and contribute her bus fare by walking home from school for a month. Ma Karpuri remembers trudging with her fellow volunteers Bharati and Lalita day after day from one shop in Coimbatore to another, attempting to convince a spectrum of puzzled, suspicious, and indifferent tradesmen, from grocers to tea-shop owners, of the importance of the cause, and feeling a surge of triumph with every 5 rupees that came their way. As an energy form, the Dhyanalinga is what Sadhguru has famously called a concoction of pure awareness and madness. In the future, if one day some realized beings who are very sensitive come to that place and access the Dhyanalinga the way it really is, they will go crazy with laughter. It is so dead serious on one level, and done so playfully on another level. It was built like that, slowly. It is life-sustaining in one way. It is life-taking in another way. For those who have experienced Sadhguru as a master, there seems very little difference between him and the Dhyanalinga. One is made of flesh and blood, and the other of stone, but the quality of the presence, the subtle body in yogic terms, feels essentially the same. What is the difference is another question that Sadhguru is often asked. None whatsoever, replies Sadhguru candidly. It's just that I still have the problems of eating and sleeping. He doesn't. Another difference is that I took 3 lifetimes to become like this. He managed it in 3 years. Above all, once you have a physical body, people's ability to experience what is beyond that will decrease. Because once you see a person, you start judging, seeing what's right and wrong about him, what appeals to you or doesn't. All these judgments will take away your ability to experience that being. When you sit in front of a living guru, you have many problems, judgments, likes and dislikes, because invariably you end up looking at his personality. With the Dhyanalinga, you don't have these problems, because he doesn't carry a physical or mental body. If you experience him once, every time you sit, you will look up to him reverentially. If he had a physical body, one moment you would be looking up to him reverentially, the next moment you would be judging him and condemning him for something. So he has come with extra advantages. And that remains an ironic but accurate summation of the distinction. For those who have known and been touched by him, however, the master with the physical body, however overbearing, however challenging, remains a distinct improvement on the master endowed with only a subtle one. The Dhyanalinga is a transformational experience, but Isha meditators would probably consider their generation the lucky one. They have had the privilege of knowing two gurus in the same lifetime.